que no sean solamente... Esta reunión está siendo grabada. Incluir otras identidades que no sean solamente mujeres, que también es un campo en sí de disputa. En Argentina, desde el año 2016, hubo un promedio de 312,5 femicidios anuales. Esto es claramente una cifra tentativa y estimada porque hay un subregistro del femicidio, en Argentina como en cualquier otro contexto. Esto nos presenta con un problema inicial que tiene que ver con hablar y pensar y abordar un fenómeno del cual no tenemos una clara referencia estadística o un panorama estadístico. Para este primer trimestre del año 2021 hubo 70 femicidios en Argentina. Next slide, please. Estos datos que presento acá los construí yo, los presentamos en función de las estadísticas sanitarias, que claramente no son la mejor fuente de estadística, pero nos permiten tener algún tipo de indicadores sobre cuál es la magnitud del femicidio. Hago un comentario. Hablo de femicidio y no de feminicidio en el caso de Argentina porque es el concepto que utilizamos en la ley nacional. Hay obviamente diferencias conceptuales, pero me atengo a esto simplemente por una cuestión normativa, digamos. En Argentina la tasa es de 1,1 por 100.000 habitantes, que es una tasa, de vuelta, complicado hablar de alto o bajo, pero es considerada intermedia en comparación con otros contextos. El 64% de víctimas femeninas de homicidio, es decir, de todas las muertes que han ocurrido de mujeres intencionales, fueron femicidios bajo esta clasificación. Y el 44% de los femicidios fueron en mujeres de edades de 24 a 44 años. Como sabemos, la mayor parte de la violencia letal, tanto en varones como en mujeres o población trans, es en edades, entre comillas, jóvenes. Vemos acá que la estadística muestra es un poco más elevada que el homicidio, pero nada, no es un dato del todo relevante. Y lo que sí es relevante y que replica la misma tendencia de otros países de América Latina es que el 83% de los casos tenían una relación previa y que el 66% de los casos ocurrieron en la casa de la víctima. Esto nos marca un poco cómo es el femicidio acá, que es principalmente cometido por relaciones, por parejas previas o por parejas actuales, y que es en el contexto de la vivienda de la víctima. Lo cual nos muestra que tenemos más preponderancia o más tendencia a que la incidencia principal del femicidio sea femicidio íntimo, sea femicidio de pareja. Bueno, acá esta es la zona en la que estamos trabajando, es el área metropolitana de Buenos Aires. Ahora, ¿por qué abordar un tema tan polémico? Hay algunas cuestiones que en realidad que vienen delineadas por una brecha en la literatura. La mayor parte de los estudios, inclusive de la producción estadística que hay, se focaliza en la víctima. Esto es lógico, desde ya, es conocer quiénes son víctimas de violencia sistemática. No obstante, y además de que se focaliza principalmente en las víctimas, la mayor parte de la producción académica e inclusive estatal que hay es estadística o cuantitativa. Nosotros tenemos descripciones de quiénes mueren, en qué contextos, bajo qué modalidades, qué relaciones previas tuvieron. Pero no sabemos en qué tipo de vínculo tenían previamente, cómo era experimentado ese vínculo, cómo eran las trayectorias de quienes lo cometieron, etc. Hay un gran vacío para entender la situación en términos más profundos, digamos. Y acá se replica lo que es muy común en los estudios de violencia en general, que es que si tenemos que explicar por qué ocurrió un femicidio o por qué ocurrió algún tipo de violencia, algo central para nosotros como analistas o científicos sociales es comprender quiénes ejercen esa violencia y por qué lo están haciendo. Ahora, ese por qué es problemático, es complicado, porque es un por qué que nosotros podemos decir, bueno, ellos lo hicieron por tal motivo, o podemos decir que tuvieron una enfermedad mental, un problema de salud mental, pero en realidad tenemos que entenderlo en los propios términos en que ellos lo plantean. Es un gran plus para nosotros como científicos entenderlo la lógica en la cual hicieron algo. Next slide, please. Gracias. Y ahí vienen los retos de esta línea de investigación. Uno es la polisemia de la violencia. lo que el perpetrador dice que es violencia puede ser diferente a lo que yo defino como una violencia. Diferente es de lo que puede ser un tipo de espectador como un policía o un psicólogo. Entonces ahí ya nos metemos en un terreno un poco más complicado. Como ya les decía antes, el femicidio es un fenómeno extremadamente subreportado y subregistrado. Y como decía antes, hay una falta de estudios cualitativos. Y esos estudios que nos permitan entender cuál es la racionalidad de quienes lo llevan a cabo. Un último reto es el acceso a esta población, porque efectivamente si cometieron un femicidio y han sido procesados, están en contextos difíciles de acceder para nosotros como investigadores o como investigadores. Next slide, please. Ahora, lo primero que voy a comentar ahora, vamos a hablar de dos estudios en particular que desarrollamos. Este primero se focalizó en analizar las narrativas explicativas de varones que cometieron femicidio íntimo. Es decir, nosotros quisimos intentar descifrar qué racionalidad hay detrás del femicidio a partir de cómo lo explicaron. Puntualmente lo que nosotros hicimos fueron entrevistas abiertas, charlas sin ningún tipo de guión, para entender cómo los estaban explicando, qué tipos de recursos utilizaban, cómo definían la violencia. Next slide, please. Nosotros hicimos una propuesta en función de estas entrevistas tan particulares que fueron con los varones, que era ver qué elementos traían en las entrevistas. Digo, porque son entrevistas muy tensas en las cuales se pone mucho en juego, porque hay una persona que ha sido condenada por femicidio y se justifican de muchas formas, neutralizan su acción, digamos. Y lo que nosotros encontramos, y ahí viene esta tipología, esta propuesta, fueron dos grandes, vamos a llamarlo ejes o dimensiones, con las cuales ellos nos explicaron el femicidio que cometieron. Uno, que por ahí es el más interesante, es el alcance, las explicaciones de qué alcance eran. ¿Eran individuales o eran contextuales? Y esto es muy importante porque para entender cómo lo razonan y por qué lo hicieron, tenemos que ver qué tipo de justificaciones utilizan. Y vimos que estaban, por un lado, estas explicaciones contextuales. Es decir, explicaban que lo hicieron en función de algo que no tenía que ver con ellos. Por ejemplo, la forma en que los criaron, las responsabilidades laborales, el contexto económico. Ahí hacían alusión a aspectos que trascendían su propia agencia, su propia responsabilidad. Y otro conjunto de factores tenían que ver con factores o explicaciones individuales. Y vamos a ver que no todas las explicaciones individuales recaían en ellos, que bueno, muestra un poco la seriedad del tema. Y la otra dimensión que se pusieron en juego era, o que ellos narraban al menos, era si esta violencia fue constante a lo largo de la relación o era, desde su perspectiva, algo extraordinario. Entonces nosotros propusimos estas 4 grandes tipos de explicaciones que ellos emplearon, que utilizaron. Una que es la narrativa de la víctima, en la cual ellos se veían víctimas de un contexto. Se veían víctimas inclusive nos han hablado de víctimas del patriarcado, víctimas de una sociedad machista, víctimas del capitalismo. Y en estos relatos hay una particularidad que después vamos a ver que se repite en otros relatos: la mujer tiene un rol secundario. Si el capitalismo o el patriarcado o cualquier estructura tiene un rol protagónico para explicar, la mujer siempre aparecía como algo secundario, algo que no tenía tanta agencia ni tanta centralidad. Dentro de estas explicaciones que nos dieron, en donde la violencia era constante y recurrente, había otras que hacían alusión a explicaciones de tipo más individual. Y acá vimos diferentes formas. Algunas que tenían que ver con descontextualización total. En particular, muchos nos empezaban a hablar de que tenían trastornos mentales. Lo cual es muy interesante porque nos decían, bueno, tengo un trastorno de personalidad, tengo una personalidad border, tengo esto y lo otro. Y ahí lo que veíamos en realidad era cómo impactaba la situación de encierro y el contacto con ciertos dispositivos terapéuticos en su narrativa. Y en cierta medida nos mostraba nuestra propia deficiencia en nuestro sistema carcelario con esta población, porque en vez de hacer modificaciones en cuanto a cómo se narran a sí mismos, lo hacen, lo que terminan utilizándolo es como una justificación de la acción. Otro conjunto de narrativas, que me voy a la segunda parte del cuadro, eran narrativas en las cuales ellos no dieron cuenta y explicitaron que no hubo violencia durante esa relación, salvo al final. Entonces, me hablaban de esta violencia como algo extraordinario. Y en la el primer tipo, que lo llamamos la excepcionalidad, nuevamente había algo de factor contextual que hacía que en ese momento haya violencia. De vuelta, no hay agencia. De vuelta, ellos no son responsables de la acción. Y la responsabilización de esta violencia en algún factor externo, en general de la órbita laboral. También hacían referencia a algunas cuestiones familiares, pero era el trabajo el principal responsable. Y por último, y por ahí es el tipo más complicado, es la narrativa del exabrupto, en donde ellos mencionaban que la violencia fue algo extraordinario y la responsabilidad era de tipo individual, pero era, entre comillas desde ya, responsabilidad de la víctima. Este es el caso como más atroz de victim blaming, de responsabilizar a la víctima. No fueron la mayor cantidad de entrevistados de los que encontramos que dijeran esto. Fueron los más directamente negadores de la situación. Ahí no se identificaban en absoluto con la figura del agresor. A pesar de que haya diferencias, como vemos en esta tipología que estábamos empezando a pensar, hay ciertos aspectos que atraviesan todas estas racionalidades. Could we move to the next slide, please? Bueno, acá hay algunos tipos, algunos fragmentos de entrevista. Creo que lo fui diciendo un poco antes, pero bueno, en esta narrativa inicial de víctima hacen referencias, por ejemplo, uno de los entrevistados nos dijo: me criaron así, mi viejo, mi tío, mi abuelo, no me mostraron otras formas de tratar a las mujeres. Los que, yo les decía, estas segundo tipo en las cuales hacía mucha referencia a problemas de salud mental. Uno nos dijo: mis amigos pensaban que yo era celoso, ahora sé que tengo un problema de salud mental, tengo una personalidad agresiva y controladora. Vuelvo a decir que para mí esta es muy problemática porque invisibiliza y descontextualiza que esto no es un problema de salud mental, o no solamente es un problema de salud mental, sino que es algo sistemático. Esta narrativa extraordinaria, un entrevistado nos comentó que lo habían rajado, despedido del trabajo, del laburo, y estaba destrozado porque me habían hecho la cama, le habían hecho una trampa, hijos de puta. Pero yo jamás le había levantado la mano. Hay una justificación total y de vuelta no hay agencia de parte de ellos. Es muy interesante cómo va y viene la agencia en algo contextual o en la víctima, y rara vez son ellos los que se ponen en el lugar de quien hace o comete la acción. Y por último, esta narrativa tan atroz que había comentado antes, un entrevistado nos dice: es complicado seguir diciendo esto, pero aunque sí la haya matado, ella estaba haciendo todo lo posible para molestarle, para sacarme de quicio, me volvió loco. Son por las narrativas que encontramos más en medios de comunicación, en literatura, en películas, como las más atroces. Pero acá sí lo que encontramos empíricamente es que no son las más recurrentes en estos varones. And the next slide, I think it's the last one. Yo lo que les decía antes es que, bueno, acá nosotros diversificamos, intentamos entender qué lógicas había para explicar este evento y para neutralizarlo, es decir, para no sentirse culpables. Y hay unos elementos que fueron muy transversales, que son, por un lado, interesantes para explorar y ver qué pasó, pero también son muy alarmantes porque muestran qué tipo de lógica hay detrás en estos varones para que cometan un acto de violencia. El femicidio fue presentado como un giro biográfico, es decir, un momento importante en la vida de estas personas. era de esperarse, era nuestra hipótesis, que sea algo relevante que marque un antes y un después, ¿no? No obstante, y esto por ahí es lo más interesante, el significado de este giro, de este cambio importante en sus vidas, estaba más relacionado con estar en la cárcel que con cometer el femicidio. Y acá había varias cuestiones. Para ellos era más importante, claramente, estar en la cárcel y que se los juzgue como femicidios. Pero en sus relatos, el cometer el femicidio no siempre fue algo central. Y eso es, en última instancia, un indicador de los niveles de misoginia que existen en nuestra o nuestras sociedades. Un detalle no menor, que creo que en la última charla se mencionó algo de esto, que es que el encarcelamiento está asociado en algunos casos con un giro positivo. Es decir, llegar a la cárcel es algo que ellos a veces tenían pensado como que iba a ocurrir en algún momento de sus vidas, no necesariamente por un femicidio. Eso fue común en sectores pobres y marginalizados. Ahí es una alerta, esa red flag para nosotros, porque nos está mostrando que la clase social claramente intercede para entender el femicidio y muestra cuán naturalizado puede estar una muerte violenta, en este caso un femicidio, e ir a la cárcel. Para nosotros es terrible, por supuesto para cualquiera, ¿no? Y por último, otro aspecto que fue transversal es que la violencia siempre es originada externamente. O es la mujer, o es el trabajo, o es el capitalismo, o es el machismo, o es el problema de salud mental que yo tengo, pero que yo no soy. Es mi trastorno mental, yo no soy mi trastorno mental. Y nunca es el self o el yo. El sujeto nunca se vincula de forma directa con ese femicidio. Son datos provisorios en la medida en que nosotros hicimos entrevistas, pero nos gustaría hacer más, y que nos sirvió para empezar a entender y desarmar cómo lo están razonando y qué resortes o qué pilares tienen detrás. Estoy haciendo que la interpretación sea imposible con las palabras. Perdón, Megan. Pero bueno, nos muestra esto que nosotros hablamos de racionalidad o de narrativa para entenderlo. Y acá doy cierre a esta primera parte de la presentación que tiene que ver con este primer paper y dejo a Dabney que hable en a clearer and simpler language.
Gracias, Martín. Before we switch over, Claire, do we need to transition on the translation?
Yeah. Si necesitan interpretación a español, pueden ir seleccionándolo abajo, y quiero hacer una prueba. Dabney, can you just say something in English? And Megan, can you just do a little test? People who need si necesitan la interpretación, ¿me puede dar como así que se escucha? O abajo en el chat, porque no sé si lo están escuchando.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Is it working?
Okay, está bien.
Okay,
it's good.
Gracias. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to Martín and thanks to Claire and the network for hosting this conversation. We're really glad to be here this afternoon. Martín mentioned that this is a line of work that we're working on together for a couple of years, and we were really excited by this sort of archetypal work that he described. And the next things that we wanted to do is we wanted to sort of put this to the test and examine it from a couple of different perspectives. So the next bit of work that I'm going to be talking about is a thematic narrative analysis of also men who committed femicide in Buenos Aires. And specifically, we wanted to examine risk factors, because this work is not only sociological and criminological, but it's also a matter of public health. It's also a matter of human rights, and it's a matter of gender equality. So we wanted to think about it from those perspectives as well. So the purpose of the work that I'm going to be talking about is really to identify risk factors and gendered narratives that enabled femicide and gender-based violence to occur among perpetrators of intimate femicide in Buenos Aires. And the methods for this paper I've alluded to already. we conducted narrative interviews with cisgender males in Buenos Aires, and we did a narrative thematic analysis. So these were qualitative interviews based on, and we analyzed the data as such. We developed an original code book, and we were particularly interested in looking at issues of identity, that is, again, how perpetrators saw themselves, questions of gender and gender norms, views of violence, and then views of health or experiences of health and femicide in particular, as well as intimate partner violence. We use the software program MaxQDA to analyze the data, and this research was funded by the University of Buenos Aires. So I'll start by giving a brief overview of the demographics. In this part of the work, we had 13 participants who ranged in age between 18 and 42 years of age, and they participated in 33 unstructured in-depth interviews. So there were some participants that we interviewed 3 times, some twice, and some only once, depending on their preferences and what they wanted to talk about. And it was really driven by them in terms of what they wanted to talk about. And so this unstructured interview style really allowed them to bring to the fore the things that were most on their mind. But again, we were analyzing it from the perspective of their views of violence and health and gender norms, as well as identity. The victims of these 13 men, 9 of them were their wives or girlfriends or regular sexual partners. A few were ex-girlfriends or ex-partners, and 2 were acquaintances. So the vast majority were victims of their current or former partners. And I think that's important to underscore. We know that this is most often the case. And there were 3 themes that emerged that I'll be talking about and diving into today. The first is the concept of abandonment. So you heard Martín talk about life turning points in our earlier archetypal work. And this is really something that comes up in this thematic analysis. So abandonment is something that happened in the lives of several of these men. And that experience of abandonment, oftentimes in childhood, triggers possessiveness in their future intimate relationships. The second theme that I'll talk about is that perpetrators do not view themselves as violent. And you heard Martín allude to this as well, right? It's, I have a mental problem, not that it's about me. So they don't see themselves in this way. And the third theme that I'll explore in depth is that violence is a transference of emotional pain, such that these men do not have the ability to, number one, regulate their emotions or otherwise express their emotions in healthy ways. And so the ways that their emotional pain manifests is in physical violence of their partners. And we'll be giving some quotes here. So I just want to give a warning to everyone that we'll be using the words of the perpetrators themselves. These quotes will be in English. And then as I'll allow you to read the quotes, and as you're doing so, I will be explaining the theme itself as they're outlined here on the screen. Whoops. So the first theme is that abandonment triggers possessiveness among perpetrators. So participants who were abandoned during childhood by one or both parents projected suspicion and accusations about leaving onto their partners. This suspicion was mechanized by controlling their partner's movements, employment status, access to money, and who they spent time with. High levels of control were established early in the relationship, setting expectations moving forward. When challenged, or if partners sought to change this dynamic, participants felt disrespected and that unspoken agreements in the relationship had been violated, principally manifesting as a violation of gender norms. This was illustrated both in the unequal acceptance of previous abandonment in their own lives and freedoms afforded within the intimate relationship. So basically, many participants who spoke about someone in their life leaving them while they were young were convinced that their partners were secretly planning to leave them, which on occasion was actually true. And so you see this quote here, she wanted to leave. She wanted to leave my house. And I said no. And that's what happened. It was that she was leaving. She was putting things together, which I had also bought. And I said no, she couldn't leave whenever she wanted, that it was my house and she wasn't going to leave, just like nothing from one day to the next. You can't do that to someone. You can't get out of here, move on up, and then grab your panties and leave. And so we're at the end of it. So this was the trigger for possessiveness and ultimately violence and the femicide that ensued. The next theme that we explored was that perpetrators do not view themselves as violent. Participants frequently did not self-identify as people who perpetrated violence, even though all of the participants in the study had been convicted of femicide. This was evidenced by frequently repeating, quote, "I'm not a violent person," or, quote, "I'm not like the other guys in here." This affirms prior studies that concluded that perpetrators exclude themselves from a problematic social group of violent offenders. In stressing the context of the femicide over the outcome of the event, death, perpetrators maintain narratives of moral decency. And this self-impunity was also illustrated in multiple participants stressing, you need to understand the context. And so context, which you also heard Martín speak about, referred to several things. First, it referred to the role that violence played in their upbringings, their families, their communities, their friends, and their relationships. You heard earlier the quote about my father, my uncle, my grandfather, and so on. Context also referred to getting involved in crime or criminal activities at a young age, which further normalized violence behavior among men that they interacted with. For example, one participant saying that jail is crime school. And then the third way in which participants described context was a denial of the gendered motive of their crime. So this was a common theme for perpetrators who felt that their case did not have a gendered motive, and they used it as a rationale for self-impunity when referring to community norms around violence, including blaming anti-femicide or feminist movements for their imprisonment. They felt that the charge of femicide had been pinned on them to justify social movements rather than identifying with a gender-based motive for their crime. And particularly in cases of homicide and femicide, the female victim was often viewed as someone who just got in the way, a type of collateral damage. And these participants were much more concerned with the homicide of a man rather than the femicide of a woman who was, as I mentioned, seen as collateral damage. And so we share one quote here from one perpetrator who said, I mean, it didn't look good. And you see that what matters is that it looks good, that they create the story to say it in some way. It didn't matter that there was no intention of hurting her or that something like this had never happened, something so heavy. No, it just matters for how they fit things in. So this is a participant who was referring to a murder, a homicide-suicide in which he had been convicted of killing a woman who was actually his ex-girlfriend when he and his friends were confronting another man. And he claimed that this woman who was his former partner just got in the way and that the fight wasn't about her. And so he really pinned this on the femicide, anti-femicide movements. And again, you see the last part of the quote, I feel like I'm a victim of this shitty context. The last theme is violence as a transference of emotional pain. So in this instance, participants expressed wanting to make their partner feel the same pain physically that they were feeling emotionally. And this was present when explaining episodes of intimate partner violence and when describing the femicide. So one participant, Santiago, described that after a fight about him coming home later than expected and dinner getting cold, his girlfriend went out dancing. He described his violence as a transference of his emotional pain by saying, when she got home, we fought, and yes, I slapped her, but I swear it was something stronger than me. It's just that their girl puts you in that place of suffering, leaves you there, and a man is a machine where anything can happen. And she escaped one blow, crying and carrying on. After everything that's happened, I see it differently. It was the first time something like this had happened, but I swear to you, I lived it like I couldn't contain myself, and she was doing that to me. So here you see some of the echoes of the things that Martín talked about in terms of seeing the violence as exceptional and something outside of the perpetrator themselves sort of taking over. And then we have this other quote that you see shared on the screen from our participant, Marcos. All of these names are pseudonyms. It was like I was gathering smoke and I exploded. I erupted. I grabbed a jar and threw it at her with all the strength I had. I didn't think, I just wanted to unload. I threw a bottle at her. She broke down and started crying and screaming, and I hit her. and I wanted to unload. I wanted her to understand what I felt like inside, like that rage. This theme of violence, of transference of emotional pain, is important in understanding how men relate to the narratives around emotion in the context of gender norms. I'll move on to talking about some of the limitations of our study. First of all, we didn't have access to legal files or any quantitative data collection for these interviews. Therefore, we were not able to triangulate data or to verify the information that was given to us during the interviews. However, since our purpose was really to understand the narratives of perpetrators themselves, this was okay with us, although we do believe that triangulation of other data could be useful in the future. Our data were limited to self-identified heterosexual cisgendered men, and therefore we can't say anything about femicide among same-sex couples or other gender identity dyads, including trans folks. And we also came in contact with these participants through the Argentinian correctional system. And so what this means is that we only included people that were convicted of femicide, but not those who were uncharged for a crime or those who were charged but not convicted. And the other limitation that I'll point out is that these data do not account for murder-suicides, which happens very frequently, nor does it account for family annihilators, which are people who kill other members in their family, for example, their own children or stepchildren. So we do have some limitations, but these are also areas where we could use more information generally. Oops. So to try and tie things together here, experiences of abandonment appear to have a significant impact on controlling behaviors among perpetrators of femicide. Alterations to the relationship expectations of gender norms were triggers for violence. And specifically, the femicides that resulted from men panicking at their partner's attempted departures or perceived attempted departures stressed the perceived importance of possession and control in a relationship as a moral defense of family. There seemed to be a consistent formula for the violence that appeared within this theme. For example, partners' perceived violation of gender norms triggered violence, and that violence was designed to communicate disapproval and reestablishment of the gender norm status quo. The inverse justification was also present in the underlying assumption. For example, if I don't get violent, my masculinity will be threatened. In this way, violence is merited as a way to create and maintain a social position and an expression of emotions. These feelings may result from a perceived lack of control of their partner or family, threats or fears of infidelity, and abandonment. This bolsters pre-existing research on violence as a tool in defending and restoring the established gender power balance. In this way, femicide was a transference of the emotional pain the perpetrator was feeling onto their partner. Similar findings have been presented in studies where male perpetrators of violence claim that something their partner did or made them feel inadequate. And they felt the need to show their physical
Dabney,
control.
can you stop for just 1 second? Sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure that the interpreting is working.
Sure.
I had a message that they can't hear Megan. Megan, can we just test? Can somebody give me a thumbs up that they can hear Megan? ¿Alguien me puede dar un señal que se puede escuchar a Megan?
Martín is giving a thumbs up.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's okay. And hopefully we didn't miss too much, but I'll start by speaking about emotional pain here. So as femicide as a tool of transferring emotional pain, other studies have found where male perpetrators of violence claim that their partner did something or said something that made them feel inadequate. And so they had to express their emotions through use of physical control of the situation in order to stop that feeling in themselves. So traditional views of masculinity and machismo culture do not prioritize and often demonize men emoting. Emotional regulation skills are underdeveloped, especially when this doctrine of machismo is adopted at a young age. And this creates an enabling environment where violence seems like the only option to communicate and deal with emotions. Prevailing theories on this dichotomy elucidate the danger that highly patriarchal societies have in creating environments where violence can occur. And at a societal and cultural level, the difference between what will make someone turn violent with their wife or girlfriend in the face of humiliation and stay calm, for example, in a work situation, if they experience humiliation by a boss or a peer, is that those men feel entitled to do so within the context of an intimate relationship, where they may not feel entitled to do so in a work or other hierarchical structure. And this was illustrated in Juan's story. He was a man who never was violent in his work situation, even though he was treated poorly, and he spoke about it at length. However, a few months later, he killed his wife after she decided to stop to buy tickets to her preferred vacation destination instead of his. So our recommendations are listed here. We believe that this analysis provides evidence that bolsters the demands of women's rights groups, including Ni Una Menos, to address the role that machismo and patriarchy plays in femicide justification. And we also support the demand to view gender-based violence and intimate partner violence as a public health and human rights problem. We also elucidate the need for research into social and psychological services targeting perpetrators of gender-based violence in Argentina, as well as gender norms change. Many of the participants in the study who were in correctional facilities would reference programs that they were participating in. And so this was a potential opportunity to really, rather than treat the carceral system as a place where we send people away to learn more about crime, as was indicated by our participants, to actually treat this as a place where we might do some rehabilitation and redemption. So currently, the majority of violence prevention focuses on victims identifying risk factors and removing themselves from potentially violent situations. This puts the burden of responsibility on victims or potential victims of violence, and it causes disruption in the lives of victims. Based on our analysis, we recommend designing violence prevention interventions that target harmful narratives and behaviors in potential perpetrators of violence. And in doing so, shifting the responsibility from victims of violence to perpetrators themselves and society at large. So programming directed towards men and boys, facilitating strategies for healthy relationships will create healthier individuals, relationships, and families. And in doing so, primary prevention of gender-based violence can be addressed at all levels of the socio-ecological model. Femicide is undoubtedly a gendered phenomenon, a public health issue, and a human rights violation that is methodologically difficult to study. Though legislative efforts have been made to address the previous under-investigation and prosecution, machismo and patriarchy enable environments where femicide continues to occur in private settings. This analysis addresses the gaps in knowledge about experiences of gender norms, violence, and femicide from the perspective of perpetrators of femicide. In this study, we had a unique opportunity to understand the life course narratives of perpetrators from a qualitative emic perspective, that is, their own perspective. And in doing so, we can better understand the narratives around gender, conceptualization of life events, and decision-making processes that enabled men to commit femicide. And in this way, we're able to simultaneously study risk factors of femicide and gender-based violence. And these are just some of our references.